You're listening to The Jacob Valk Show. He's breaking down the latest and greatest in sports as only he can. Follow him on Twitter at RealJacobValk. Here he is, Jacob Valk.
Welcome to another edition of the Jacob Valk Show. I am Jacob Valk. And at the end of this show, you're going to get the interview that I did with Richard Bressler, the author of the book on Frank Selee. It was very, very interesting. I had a really good time talking to him. But I have to start with a story that I really didn't want to talk about. I knew I was going to have to talk about it at some point, but truthfully, I was hoping to save it for Monday's Brooklyn Nets show. But there's no avoiding it now. It's dominating all NBA coverage. And that is Kyrie Irving's absence. Now, him sitting out games is one thing, but yesterday, a video was, for lack of a better word, leaked, showing him at a party with a bunch of family members, and they're all without masks. There's a lot to unpack when it comes to this story. Kyrie Irving's last game was January 5th. The Capitol riots were the day after. Kyrie Irving is very active in social justice. He was one of the guys who didn't want the players to go to Disney. He didn't think that was the right way to raise awareness for Black Lives Matter. And everyone put two and two together and thought that Kyrie being out was because he was deeply traumatized by the Capitol riots. Now, let me just say that I didn't begrudge him for sitting out the first 2 or 3 games after the riot. Kyrie Irving is a sensitive person. Racial justice is a cause that he's very passionate about. And I'm sure that when he saw people invading the Capitol building wearing Camp Auschwitz shirts, saying Sieg Heil, giving Nazi salutes, and holding up a Confederate flag, it traumatized him. It traumatized me. I'm not gonna lie to you. I've been tossing and turning in my sleep recently over the riots. I think anyone with a conscience would be disturbed by what we saw last week. Now, I understand that you still have a job to do. The day after the riot, I came on this show and denounced it. I'll be honest with you. there was a big part of me that didn't want to do the show. Because I was so deeply hurt by what I saw. But I did it. I had a job to do, and I did it. But I'm sure Kyrie Irving wasn't the only person to take a few days off after what happened at the Capitol building. People took a lot of time off after 9/11. They took a lot of time off after John Lennon was shot. Different people react in different ways. And again, Kyrie Irving is sensitive. He's very sensitive. So he's going to have a more extreme reaction to what happened. No one can begrudge that. Can you be upset that he wasn't playing? Absolutely. Especially when the Nets lose by 5 against the Grizzlies. You gotta think Kyrie Irving would have made a difference in that game. And Sunday against the Thunder, losing by 13. You gotta think Kyrie Irving would have made a difference in that game. But you've gotta understand, players are human beings. They have feelings. They're not robots. They get hurt physically and they get hurt mentally. So was I upset that Kyrie Irving wasn't playing? Absolutely. Did I understand why he wasn't playing? Yes. And I respected it. Everyone grieves in different ways. Like, I'll tell you, one time, my grandmother went into the hospital because she had really bad sepsis. In the hospital, I was trying to make jokes. I was trying to keep things light. My mom kept shooting daggers into me. Like, Jacob, what are you doing? That's not appropriate. It's like, Mom, that's how I cope with these things. I try to make some jokes. She chose to cope in a different way. She wasn't wrong, and I wasn't wrong. Everyone has their own coping mechanism. But then, as the absence grew longer, you heard more people getting upset. Sunday, okay, I guess you can accept it. I prefer not to, but hey, they're going up against the Thunder. They should beat the Thunder. That's okay. They lose by 13. And maybe Kyrie really wanted to watch the 3 NFL playoff games on Sunday. So okay, he'll come back on Tuesday. They're going up against a good Nuggets team. Yes, they've gotten off to a bad start, but still, they made the Western Conference Finals in the bubble. And right after that, they faced the Knicks, a rivalry game, the first Nets-Knicks game of the season. You gotta think Kyrie's gonna come back, right? Well, now that video came out, showing him at a party with his family members, and there are no masks in sight, Irving's gonna be out for at least the rest of the week. And probably longer because the NBA is clamping down on their coronavirus procedures. They've had a bunch of games postponed. They're limiting a lot of people's movements. George Hill just spoke out about it yesterday. I gotta say, I tend to agree with him, but I understand why the NBA is doing it. If you don't like it, opt out. I understand why you'd be upset over these new procedures. You can't leave your house, you can't leave the hotel, you can't socialize with the opposing team. if you're active and you just happen to be on the bench, you have to wear a mask. I understand why that would upset you. I don't blame George Hill for being upset. But, having said that, if this is what needs to be done to complete a season, that's what needs to be done. It stinks, but you have to do it. If you don't want to do it, opt out. It's just that simple. But the issue is that Kyrie Irving now can't come back when he decides he's ready to come back. He's processed all his emotions. Odds are he's now going to be governed by the same procedure that caused James Harden to miss a handful of games a couple weeks ago. Look, if you're a Nets fan, you have a right to be upset at Kyrie Irving's actions. When the absence first happened and he missed the first couple games, okay. You know, that's understandable. You can't get upset at that. But then as the absence went longer, and now this video comes out, that's a terrible look for Kyrie Irving. There's no question. I mean, my best friend Mark, a huge Nets fan, wants Kyrie and the team fined. His theory is that there was some kind of a cover-up. That Kyrie Irving used the Capitol riots as a cover to take some games off, relax with his family, go out to a party, and not be beholden to the NBA. And the Nets signed off on that, evidently. I gotta say, I vehemently disagree with him. I think that's a far-fetched notion, but there's no question that this video, assuming it's him, in fact, it probably is him, is a terrible look for him. You're supposedly this offended by what happened at the Capitol building, that you can't play. Now you're going out to a party with your family, and you're not taking the proper precautions. That's a bad look. There's no question. But I'm going to say this. All the people casting judgment on Kyrie Irving right now are wrong. And they're wrong simply because we don't have his side of the story. He's doing his best Greta Garbo impression. He's gone off the grid. He hasn't released any statements. Supposedly he's had very minimal contact with the Nets. He's gone radio silent. Now I understand that Kyrie Irving hates the media. He made that pawns comment before the season started. I understand that there's a contentious relationship there. For God's sake, Stephen A. Smith just called on Kyrie Irving to retire. You wonder why Kyrie hates the media. But the more he stays silent, the more negativity he's going to have to deal with. The best thing that Kyrie Irving can do is to release a statement on his Twitter account setting all this straight. If I was counseling Kyrie Irving, this is what I would want that statement to say. Like all people with a conscience, I was deeply disturbed by what happened at the Capitol building last week. In the immediate aftermath of that insurrection, I couldn't bring myself to play. I decided later on that I needed to unwind with my family members, and we went out to celebrate my sister Asia's birthday. Because that's where that footage was taken, at Asia Irving's birthday party. We should have worn masks. We should have social distanced. We were wrong to not do that, and I apologize for that. I look forward to rejoining my team as quickly as possible. Thank you very much, and go Nets. No one could begrudge that. And the reality is, Kyrie Irving isn't going to be the only player to be caught at an event not wearing a mask and not social distancing. All in all, what's really making this a big issue is that Kyrie is staying silent. We don't have his side of the story, so all this rampant speculation is running wild. Before I go crazy killing Kyrie and saying that the Nets should trade him for James Harden, who desperately wants out of Houston, you saw what he said yesterday. I want to get Irving's side of the story. The reality is it's unfair to say anything one way or the other about this situation until you get all the facts. Alright, now I'll give you some college basketball Valk talk. And I'll start with Duke, Virginia Tech. A game that I nailed. I went 2-0 in my picks yesterday. Just thought I'd throw that in there. Look, Virginia Tech thoroughly outplayed Duke this whole game. At one point in time in the first half, the Hokies were up 18. Now the Blue Devils came back. They were only down by 12 at the half, and they ended up losing by 7. But the simple fact is, Virginia Tech was the better team all throughout. I mean, this is a Duke team that isn't coalescing as well as it should. They have talented players. Matthew Hurt is talented. Jalen Johnson is talented. DJ Stewart is talented. Jeremy Roach is talented. But this is what happens when you're so reliant on freshmen. Every one of those guys that I just mentioned, with the exception of Matthew Hurt, is a freshman. There are really no juniors or seniors that Coach K really relies on. Joey Baker's not that good. Jordan Goldwire's not that good. And Patrick Tape and Mike Buckmeyer are reserve players. This is an inexperienced Duke team. And what happens sometimes when you put all these young players together is you run the risk of them not coalescing. Especially in this coronavirus climate. where team gatherings are limited. There's no question that if the coronavirus wasn't a thing, that teams like Duke and Kentucky would be better. But the reality is, for the Cameron Crazies, there's no excuse for this team to be as bad as they are. Duke is 5-3. You can tell that they're not as dominant this year as they've been in years past. Duke fans are great fans. They have a right to be upset over how the Blue Devils are playing this year. This is a Duke team that's going to be very lucky to win a game in March Madness. Depending on who they're matched up against, I'm putting them on upset alert. As for Virginia Tech, this was a really good, well-rounded game for them. They shot really well. They defended really well. Tyrese Radford was by far and away the best player on the court yesterday. He had a double-double, 18 points and 12 rebounds. Keve Aluma had 17 points. Off the bench, Jalen Cone had 14 points. This is a really good Hokies team. It's a team with a ton of experience. They really don't have too many freshmen playing big roles for them. It wouldn't surprise me if Virginia Tech went on a big run this year. Moving on now to Wisconsin, Michigan. And look, I got this right. Michigan did win. I said that would happen, but I didn't think they'd blow out the Badgers. With their win yesterday, the Wolverines became the first team in college basketball history to beat 3 ranked teams in a row by at least 19 points. They play Minnesota on Saturday. Watch out, Golden Gophers. This is a fantastic Michigan team. They can score with the best of them. 4 players yesterday for Michigan scored at least 12 points. Hunter Dickinson, my boy, had 12. Isaiah Livers has taken a big jump. He had 13. Franz Wagner had a double-double. 15 points and 10 rebounds. The high man yesterday for the Wolverines was Mike Smith. He had 16. We know that Michigan can score, but they can also defend. Livers and Dickinson both had 3 blocks yesterday. Wagner had 4 steals. How are you going to beat this Michigan team? I promise you, they're going to go on a huge run in March. I'd be stunned if they didn't make the Final Four, and they could very easily go further. As for Wisconsin, they're still a good team. They just have a ways to go if they really want to hang with the big boys. They've got to find a way to generate more offense. It's just that simple. They're a team that lives and dies with their defense. That's not going to work against the better offensive teams like Michigan or Gonzaga or Iowa, etc., etc. Demetric Trice did score 20. Micah Potter did score 12. But other than them, the rest of the Badgers team combined for just 22 points. There was one point in this game that Michigan led 69-29. That's a 2K-like score. I'm not saying Wisconsin's bad. They have some talent. But the reality is they're not in the upper echelon of college basketball teams this year. They'll win a game or two in March, but I don't see them making too much noise besides that. I do want to talk about the other game yesterday that featured a ranked team, Kansas-Oklahoma State. The Fighting Cade Cunninghams beat the Jayhawks 75-70. There is no question in my mind that Cade Cunningham will be the first overall pick in the 2021 draft. He was by far and away the Cowboys' best player yesterday. He can do everything. He can penetrate, he can shoot the midi, he can shoot the three, he's really good defensively, stays in front of his man. He's Ben Simmons with a shot. He's a point guard who just so happens to be 6'8". I love watching him play, and I love watching Oklahoma State play, to tell you the truth. Bryce Williams with a big steal late. And then throwing it down to ice the game for Oklahoma State. He had 17 points. Avery Anderson had 14. Isaac Likely had a really well-rounded game. 10 points, 4 rebounds, 6 assists, and 3 steals. Off the bench, I was really impressed by Rondell Walker. He had 8 points and 10 rebounds. This is an Oklahoma State team that on any given night is capable of going off. They were really close to beating WVU a little over a week ago. I was watching that game. And now they just knocked off one of the best teams in the nation in the Jayhawks. They're going to be a really scary team come March. I don't care who's going against them. You cannot afford to overlook the Oklahoma State Cowboys. As for Kansas, they played well in this game offensively, but defensively, they're usually much better. The only guy who showed up for the Jayhawks defensively was David McCormick. He was by far and away their best player. Had a double-double, 24 points, 12 rebounds. Also had 3 blocks. But he's going to need some help. Okai Agbaji and Marcus Garrett both scored at least 12 points. But where was the defense? Christian Braun and Jalen Wilson no-showed. The least they could do is contribute defensively. I still like the Jayhawks. I understand that they've hit a rough patch this month. They lost to Texas in Kansas. They blew out TCU. Whoop-de-doo. TCU stinks. Then they barely beat Oklahoma. And now they lost to Oklahoma State. And it doesn't get much easier for them down the line. On Monday, they have to face Baylor. On the 30th, they have to face Tennessee. They're going to need to blow out ISU, Oklahoma, and TCU in the interim, because those games against Baylor and Tennessee are going to be really, really hard-fought games. I do want to preview tonight's game between two ranked teams, Texas Tech versus Texas. See what I did there? I kind of like that. I will start with the Red Raiders, though. A really, really well-rounded team. They can stifle you defensively in terms of points against per game. They're the 7th best team in the nation. That's typical of a Chris Beard-led team. But they're also solid offensively. Mac McClung, Terrence Shannon, Kyler Edwards, and Kevin McCullough are all averaging over 10 points per game. And a guy like Marcus Santos Silva is capable of going off on any given night. With VCU, he was a very potent scorer. He hasn't gotten going to that level with Texas Tech, but you still need to respect him. But the reality is the Red Raiders' bread and butter is defense. McCullough, Namari Burnett, Shannon, Santos Silva, Jamarius Burton, they're all excellent defenders. If any team could shut down a high-octane offense like Gonzaga, Iowa, or Michigan, it's the Red Raiders. As for the Longhorns, they're similar to Texas Tech. They're all about defense also. The Longhorns this year have only given up 63.7 points per game. That's the 42nd best mark in the nation. Their perimeter defense is excellent. They only allow about 5 makes per game on 17.5 tries. That's a .271 3-point percentage that they're allowing. That is fantastic. They don't have the depth that Texas Tech has on defense, but guys like Courtney Ramey and Matt Coleman are very talented defenders. They can also score, too. They just so happen to be the Longhorns' leading scorers. Not too far behind them are Andrew Jones and Greg Brown. Kai Jones is a solid 6th man. Jericho Sims is an old-school center. This is a good Texas team. They match up really well to the Red Raiders. This is going to be an old-school defensive slugfest. The over-under is 131. Take the under. I know that sounds crazy, since the odds makers are expecting both teams to score about 65 points. I promise you, that is a fair over-under to take the under on. It wouldn't stun me if Texas Tech won. Like I said, they have the defense to shut down any opponent on any given night. But it's in Austin. I think Texas has a little more oomph than the Red Raiders. Mac McClung will be the best player on the floor, but as far as offensive depth goes, that goes to the Longhorns. We all know that both these teams are going to play great defense. It's going to be up on the offense to show up. I have more faith in Texas's offense showing up than Texas Tech's. Give me the Longhorns. Alright, now I'll give you some NHL Valk talk. And I'll start with Marcus Foligno signing a big extension with the Wild. He signed a 3-year deal worth $9.3 million, and I don't mind it. Foligno is the prototypical third liner. He used to be a really physical player. Now he's taken a step back, and that's really improved his defensive game. He only had 30 penalty minutes last year, and he was a +8. Those are the best marks of his career. And the cherry on top is that he set a career high in points last year with 25. I understand that 25 points isn't earth-shattering, but for a third liner, I'll take that in a minute. This is a very fair deal for both sides. It makes a ton of sense for all parties involved. Moving on now to the Canucks, signing Travis Hamonic to a 1-year deal worth $1.25 million. And I guess I can't get too upset at this. It's $1.25 million. It's not going to break the bank or anything. But I just don't like Travis Hamonic. I never liked Hamonic. No one saw him when he was an Islander more than me. I'm telling you, this guy was massively overrated. The guy thought he was Bobby Orr out there. He never played a lick of defense. Now, there was one goal he scored where he started out behind the net and skated up the ice and scored. Don Cherry singled it out on Coach's Corner as being very similar to a goal that Bobby Orr had scored. And it was. Look, you can be an offensive defenseman, but you've still got to be able to play some defense. Travis Hamonic, with the exception of 2 years, 14-15 and 18-19, has never been a good defenseman. It's great that you put up a lot of points, but again, you're a defenseman. You still have to play defense. I understand that the Canucks did need to upgrade their defense after seeing Chris Tanev go to the Flames. But you've got to do better than Travis Hamonic. I can't say I'm doing backflips over this deal. If the Canucks wanted to address their defense, they should have gone after Keith Yandle. According to Frank Selee of TSN, Keith Yandle has fallen out of favor with the Panthers. He isn't in their plans for this season. So in essence, the Panthers are just going to have him as a healthy scratch until they move on from him. This is a terrible decision by Bill Zito. I don't understand what he's looking at, because Keith Yandle is still a really good defenseman. He led all Panthers defensemen in points last year with 45. Is he great defensively? No, he's not, but he's not a liability back there. He certainly isn't as bad as Hamonic defensively. And he is one of the best offensive defensemen in the NHL. This guy's made 3 All-Star games. He's been with the Panthers since 16-17. He's never had less than 40 points in a season. What on earth are Bill Zito and Joel Quenneville doing? I mean, I saw Yandel play in the bubble against the Islanders. He was one of the few Panthers to show up. He had 3 assists in 4 games. Him, Mike Hoffman, Alexander Barkov, and Jonathan Huberdeau. Those are the only guys that showed up for the Panthers in the bubble. I mean, you've just opened up a big can of worms on that blue line. Besides Ekblad and Anton Strawman, who can you really count on back there? Mackenzie Weegar's solid, but he's not great. Riley Stillman's heading into his 2nd season in the NHL. I don't know how much I can count on him. Radko Gudas is a good physical presence on the blue line. But that's all he is. He's a tough guy. You can't replace Keith Yandel. I understand that the Islanders probably won't have the cap space necessary to pull off a Yandel trade. But if they can somehow finagle it, he'd make a ton of sense for the Islanders and any team that could stand to improve their defense. Moving on now to the Winnipeg Jets, signing Trevor Lewis to a 1-year deal worth $1 million. And this is a good move for the Jets. It makes a ton of sense. The one thing they really needed to do was upgrade their bottom 6. They have the top 6. Connor, Scheifele, Wheeler, Eller, Stastny, and Laine. That is a fantastic top 6. Their bottom 6 really needed a ton of help. Trevor Lewis is a proven winner in this league. He's a veteran, plays the game the right way, really good defensive forward, capable of scoring 15 to 20 points. It makes perfect sense for the Jets to want to bring him in. The one thing I'll say is they really need to get the Jack Roslovic situation sorted out. Roslovic is holding out. He wants a trade because he hasn't been able to reach a contract with the Jets. I have no idea what's going to happen there, but I'll tell you, the Jets should lock Roslovic up sooner rather than later. Alright, now I'll give you some NFL Valk talk. Specifically about the Broncos hiring George Patton as their GM. He signed a 6-year deal with the Broncos. Evidently, that's the new trend, to give these new GMs 6-year deals. It's what Joe Douglas got from the Jets. The reality is, this is a coup for the Broncos. Patton has been a highly coveted GM candidate for an incredibly long time. He's interviewed with the Browns, the Jets, a bunch of teams. He's very highly respected for what he's done with the Vikings as their assistant GM. He's been with the Vikings for 14 seasons. You gotta love this move if you're a Broncos fan. Like I said, highly respected guy in league circles. Could have had any job he wanted. He chose the Broncos, which is kind of interesting because John Elway is still in the mix there. Even though Elway isn't going to have a lot of control, Patton still needs to report to him. And I don't think he's going to have the authority to fire Vic Fangio. I think that ultimately rests with Elway. If Patton was given the assurance that he's going to have full control over what a GM should have full control of, this makes perfect sense for him to make the jump. If not, this was just a money grab. For the Broncos' sake, I hope he's given full autonomy to do whatever he wants. Because he's a very smart guy, very well-respected guy. This can work out. You've just got to give him the tools necessary to do his job properly. Alright, here's my interview with Richard Bressler. You're listening to the Jacob Valk Show. I am Jacob Valk, and I'm fortunate enough to be joined by Richard Bressler, the author of Frank Selee, Hall of Fame manager of the Boston Beaneaters and Chicago Cubs. Richard, how are you?
I'm fine. Thank you very much for having me.
No, my pleasure. So, in the 19th century, most major league managers were either former players or player managers. Yet in 1890, Selee took over in Boston despite having no major league experience whatsoever. How did he convince the Beaneaters to give him a shot?
Well, I think part of it is that he was preceded by somebody with equal credentials. The manager of the Boston Beaneaters in 1889 was a man named James Hart, who had managed against Selee in the Western Association, actually in two minor leagues. He had managed against Selee in the minor leagues in 1887 and in 1888. And James Hart had a similar background to Selee in that he had never really been a player. He had loved baseball. He had gotten involved in it in Louisville working in the office of the team and such like that. And eventually he ended up buying a minor league team in Milwaukee, and he had managed that team for 3 or 4 years, and Boston hired him to manage in 1889. He managed successfully, did a very good job, and they finished second. And then he was hired by Albert Spalding, the owner of the Chicago team, and a sporting goods magnate, to basically work for him in a sporting goods company. And so the people in Boston asked Hart to recommend somebody, and Hart recommended Selee, who he, like I said, he had managed against for 2 years. They had a very good relationship. And as a matter of fact, during the 1889 season, the Boston team had an informal agreement with Selee to recommend players from that minor league, which actually came to very great fruition after the year was over for Selee. So that's where it came from. I think it came from that connection, the connection with James Hart.
Okay, so Selee hit the ground running with the Beaneaters like that. I mean, it was really incredible, the turnaround that Selee led them to. And that turnaround happened in 1891 to 1893. What can you tell us about those Beaneaters teams?
Well, it's actually a very complicated story in that in 1889, Boston had finished one game out of first. 1890 was the year of the Players League. And if you're familiar at all with 19th century baseball, the Players League was really the biggest, I would call it, a revolution that ever happened in major sports in America ever, professional sports, because the players established a league. So there were 3 major leagues in 1890. The Boston team in 1890 was gutted. They had basically 12 main players in 1889. 9 of them went to the Players League. So the Boston team in 1899, which was Selee's job to put together, he had 3 guys left over from the year before. So he had to come up with more players. Now, it turned out he took 3 guys with him from the minor league he had been in Omaha, where he'd been the year before. He took 3 guys with him. All 3 of those guys turned out to be Hall of Famers. Bobby Lowe, Kid Nichols, Herman Long. They started in Boston with Selee in 1890. And that team, he had to fill in other players, and he was scrambling just like everybody else was in baseball because there was a shortage of players because there was 3 major leagues when there was a glut of teams. So he scrambled in 1890. Now, in 1890, at the end of the 1890 season, the Players League died. So they were supposed to get their players back, and Boston got most of their players back. They didn't get all of them, but they got most of the players back that they were supposed to get. So they got the players from the 1889 team that was a good team were joined by these 3 young guys who were kept. And all those 3 young guys turned out to be very good players. And I think they got a couple of other good players from raids that took place in the mess that was baseball in the spring of 1891, and they came up with quite a good team. And it was a very tight pennant race. They were behind in 1891. They were behind almost all the way, and they ended up finishing the year in 1891 on something like they had a 16-game winning streak in September, and ended up beating the Chicago team, which was the team they were called at that time, the Chicago White Stockings. They would eventually become the Cubs, and Selee would eventually be their manager. But they were the team that they beat that year. Then in 1891, the American Association, the other major league, folded. So there were more players available, and Selee knew who some of them were. His main strength was basically evaluating talent. He was really good at it, and he got a couple of more players. And the 1892 team was very dominant. I think they won they were the first team ever in the major leagues to win more than 100 games in a season, and that team lasted until 1893. And as I've read in various places, through the life of Major League Baseball, a great team will usually last about 3 years at the top. There have been a couple of exceptions, but that's about normal when the team comes together and then things happen. The guys get hurt, right. People leave, things fall apart a little bit, and somebody else gets better.
Nowadays, there's no way that happens because of free agency.
Nowadays, you would think there would be no way that would happen because of free agency. Although it did when the Yankees did it in the late '90s. Hasn't happened since. Hasn't happened since. But
and even then, though, that was more the homegrown guys like Jeter, Williams, Georgie, Rivera. I'm a big Yankees fan.
Yeah,
those were all homegrown guys.
The base 4 guys were in that team, but they certainly filled it out with a lot of. Some good trades, like someone like Paul O'Neill, and other guys, David Justice, that was there for a little while, and David Wells,
David Cohn, sure,
and Roger Clemens. So they filled it out, which again, there's nothing new about that. But that's the last team that has been able to do it. That has been able to do it. Now, I think it's because nowadays it's so much more difficult to. In the time we're going to be talking about with Selee, where they did it. All they basically had to do was win the league. We will talk a little bit about a thing called the Temple Cup, which happened starting in the 1893 season, I think, or 1894, I forget which.
No, we can keep going about the 96
right.
to 2000 Yankees. I'm okay with that.
I figured you would be. And I mean, and they were obviously a great team, and it really lasted until 2003, right? I mean, they got to the World Series 2 more years after that, but it's just so much harder to win the World Series now because there's so many levels of playoffs and all of that stuff.
No question.
Whereas back then all you had to do was in the 1890s, the way the teams really looked at it, and actually I cover this a little bit, and I cover this in the book. In the 1892, after the Players League and the American Association had died, the National League was there as a 12-team league, and they were worried about that. They were worried that that it's too big. The teams in last place and they're going to be so far out, nobody's going to care about it. So they tried things to see what would work to keep interest going. And the first thing they tried was a split season in 1892. And the first time there was ever a playoff to get a pennant in Major League Baseball was in 1892. It was a split season. Boston won the first half. Cleveland won the second half. Boston's record throughout the year between the two of those, if you put the two halves together, Boston would have been like 12 games in front of Cleveland. But, Cleveland won the second half by like a game, I think. And they played a series after that to determine the pennant, which Boston won in 5 games. The first game was a tie, and then they swept the next 4. And then they decided that didn't work, and I think they were right. And so the next year they just played it straight, and it turned out Pittsburgh finished second. And so and there was no playoff. So a guy in Pittsburgh donated a cup called the Temple Cup. His name was Temple. Said, let's have a playoff between the first and second place teams after the season. And that happened the next 4 years, and the players just didn't give a hoot. They didn't care at all. They thought, you win the pennant, you're the champion. They would play the series. As a matter of fact, there were rumors, and I think it's pretty much considered true, that the proceeds from that series were supposed to be 65-35 from the winners and the losers, and the players amongst themselves said, the hell with that, we're doing it 50-50. And so they really didn't care about the Temple Cup. Even the second place teams, who had a little more motivation, the first place teams didn't care at all, and it showed.
Yes, it did. That was a terrible idea. I mean, okay, the premise was decent, I guess, but you've got to get the players to buy into it, and the players just didn't buy into it. You're 100% right there. So you brought up Selee's eye for talent a little earlier. There's one guy in particular that I want to talk about before anyone else. Can you lay out how Selee developed Fred Tenney?
Well, Fred Tenney was he was a college guy, which was not that uncommon in baseball, particularly in the 1890s and the 1900s, the 1900s. There were at that time, my guess is that 5% of the population went to college. 5% of the college-age population was in college, because colleges just weren't very, they were a rich man's thing back then. But the population in the major leagues was higher than that. When you get to the 1900s, it was something like 15 or 20%. So, but they used to play the Beaneaters used to play exhibition games against Northeastern colleges all the time. They played Harvard and Yale and the other teams around there. And one of the teams they played was Brown, and Tenney was he was on the Brown team, and that's where they found him. He was, they played against him in a couple of exhibition games when he was at Brown. And he was a left-handed catcher, which was not that uncommon back then. There is one of the favorite things in one of my favorite baseball books, which is Bill James' Historical Abstract. He has a long thing in there about how there's no reason that people can't be left-handed catchers. It's just, he goes into why it happens, but there's no real reason for it. And back then, people were left-handed catchers, and that's what Tenney was. And they spotted him, and they signed him fairly quickly. I think he went back to school for a little bit, and then came and joined them. And that happened in 1895 or 96, I think. That was one of the pieces of something that Selee did between the 1893 team and the 1897 team. He basically turned over most of the team. And Tenney was one who was going to come in. He played a little bit of catcher, but they didn't like him there that much. They moved him to the outfield for a little while, and he played a bit of the outfield in like 1896. And then in 1897, their first baseman, who had been there a long time, that guy named Tommy Tucker, who was like the first great switch hitter ever in baseball. He was the first switch hitter ever to win a batting title. And he had gotten old. He was like 35 or something. And he started the 1897 season as the first baseman and didn't do very well. So they moved Tenney into first base, and he basically stuck. He became quite a good first baseman. He was the first baseman, obviously, for the 97 and 98 pennant-winning teams, and lasted playing until 1908. So it was the start of a great career for him.
Talking to Richard Bressler, the author of Frank Selee, Hall of Fame manager of the Boston Beaneaters and Chicago Cubs. So would you be able to describe how Selee groomed Jimmy Collins?
Yeah, he was another one that was a little interesting. They found him, I'm pretty sure, playing. They played against the minor league team that he was with. He was from Buffalo, and I think they played an exhibition game or two against the Buffalo minor league team. Big league teams played a lot more exhibition games back then than they do now. I mean, they would play 10 or 12 a year, and so they saw him and they liked him and they signed him, and he signed with Boston. And I think I'm right about this. They signed him in 1894. He came to Boston. He played a little bit. He wasn't very good. And then they basically farmed him out, but to another major league team, because there was no such thing as a farm system back then.
Right.
They sold him to the Louisville team, which was in the National League, which is a major league team, but they sold him with the option to get him back. That was how they termed it. That's how it was termed in the newspaper reports that I saw. They said, you can't sell him to anybody else. You can only sell him to us. And so he went to Louisville and played for about a year and played quite well. He got good. He got better. He was quite young when he started. I think he was like 19 or so. And he played for a year there. And then then I think in 1895, Selee made what was probably his most successful trade. And he traded a guy named Billy Nash, who was the third baseman, to Philadelphia for Billy Hamilton. Billy Nash had been a very good player. He'd been on the first three championship teams. They were comparable ages. I think Nash was 32. Hamilton was 30. Hamilton was a center fielder and was a great leadoff man. Nash, they needed help in the outfield, so they got the outfielder, and they had what they thought was their third baseman in Collins. So they got Collins back. Nash was gone, and that sort of started to lay. That was one of the other things that laid the groundwork for the second championship team. So they did, and actually Nash, who was the captain of the team until he got traded, he had played with Collins for a short period of time while Collins was there, and he told Selee, he said, "This kid's really good. He's not polished yet, but he's going to be really good." And Selee believed him, and he was able to make the arrangement so that he could get the work that he needed somewhere else, which was...
Hey, if it works, it works.
That's right. All right. I mean, if you're a big Yankee fan and you know Yankee history, they used to do that with Kansas City back in the late 50s and the early 60s. So
Maris.
Yeah, Maris and others.
Definitely.
So it's not like it was unheard of in the major leagues ever since. But yeah, that's where they found him, and so that was another Hall of Famer that he came up with.
So Tenney and Collins were integral parts of the second group of great Beaneaters teams that Selee managed. But
Yes.
There's more to that story. What can you tell us about the 1897 and 1898 Beaneaters?
Well, the 1890s. First of all, the remember the Boston one of the things that's interesting is if you think about, depending on how you think of a decade, I think a decade's from 1 to 0. It's more popular if you can go from 0 to 1. But if the decade of the 1890s that starts in 1891 to 1900, in the National League, which except for the 1891 season was the only major league, the managers of the champion of the National League were only two people, Frank Selee and Ned Hanlon.
Is that right? I didn't know that.
That's if you do it that way. If you do it that way. So Ned Hanlon was the manager. He had been manager in Pittsburgh. He was learning a job. Then in 1892 he took over at Baltimore. He built the Baltimore Orioles. The Baltimore Orioles of John McGraw and Wilbert Robertson, and the famous Baltimore Orioles. They won the three championships.
Team that later became the Yankees.
Yes. Yeah. Well,
depending on who you ask.
Depending on how you trace the Baltimore Orioles.
When I was first learning baseball, I learned it as the Orioles became the Highlanders and became the Yankees. I know there's some controversy about that now, but that's just how I learned it growing up.
Yeah. Well, the thing is that what it was is that and I can get into that a little more later, but that Baltimore team was a great team. They won the pennant from 94 to 96. They were the dirtiest team in baseball. They were that's what they were known for. They were great. Make no mistake about them. Someone like John McGraw was a really good player.
Yes, he was.
And they had many other. They had Wee Willie Keeler. Had Dan Brothers. They had and Wilbert Robertson was the catcher. He was quite a good player. They had a really good team, but they were really dirty. They did everything they could illegally to win a game. And when there was only one umpire on the field, they could do a lot. And they did a lot. And so in 1897, when Boston, the 1897 was the only really excellent pennant race in the National League when it was a 12-team league and it was the only league that was going. It was a great pennant race, between Baltimore and Boston. Boston had gotten better. They got off to a terrible start that year. I think they were like 0-6. But the team that he had built got its footing, and throughout the summer they were like within a game of each other for about a month and a half, from like the middle of August till the end of September, and the rest of the league and I read this in a lot of the newspapers that I was researching in. They were all rooting for Boston because Boston wasn't dirty. They played relatively clean baseball. They didn't like grab the guy's belt when he was running by, or they didn't spike him when they went in on purpose when they slid into second base on a stolen base, and all of the things that the Baltimore team did.
Eat your heart out, Ty Cobb.
Yeah. Well, they did, and I can get back to that about the Orioles becoming the Yankees because that has a lot to do with it.
Right.
So anyway, they had this great pennant race, and it was like the only time in the 1890s where there was a critical series at the end of the season. Not the last series of the year, but the next to last series of the year, Boston went into Baltimore for a 3-game series. They were up by a half a game, and that's the only time it happened in the 1890s because the league was so big, and the schedule was so spread out. You never knew who you were going to end up playing. Well, they ended up playing that, and it was a really famous series, and I write about it in a bit, and I read a book about it. It's a really excellent book. One of my citations in here is A Game of Base Brawl, and it's about that race and all the nasty things that the Orioles did and the fact that the Beaneaters were the guys in the white hats and all of that. So I don't think I could root for a Boston team, even if they were the clean team. You're probably right. But so that it ended up then, and they had that series, and Boston won 2 out of 3 in Baltimore, and actually all the accounts that I read said that the Baltimore team played clean during that series. They weren't doing all the nasty stuff they normally did, but it was a really big deal. They had the attendance for the 3 games in 1898 was like 57,000, which is a lot. You know, the normal crowd for a game back then in Baltimore would have been like 4,000 people. So, you know, in 3 games they had 57,000. So they did that, and that was, you know, it was very successful. Then the next year came about, and the Boston team actually got a little better. They signed a couple of young pitchers. Vic Willis was one who was in the Hall of Fame. They signed him at the end of the '97 season, and he came up in '98. And they ran away with it in '98. Bill James names the 1898 Boston Beaneaters as the best team in the 19th century. You know, they were really good. They were really good. And then what happened after that is, like I said before, Ned Hanlon had been the manager of the Orioles, and he stayed the manager of the Orioles. Well, after the 1898 season had been a financial disaster for Major League Baseball. It was the first time that the baseball season, and I didn't realize this until I did the research on this book, it was the first time that a baseball season ran during wartime. The Spanish-American War happened then. And
I didn't think of that. That's good.
I didn't realize that either until I did this research. And attendance plummeted. They had a, you know, and back then attendance was all there was. There wasn't.
Can I just say really fast? I would kill to be at an event with 50,000 people right now. I hate this pandemic. Make it go away, Richard.
Okay, it's gone away.
Okay, good.
I bet that didn't work.
Darn it.
But you know, there was a lot of shakeout in baseball after that. A number of teams were really hurting, and they played the 1899 season with still a 12-team league, but there were 3 owners in the league who had financial interests in 2 teams. So it's called syndicate ownership. They had the owner of Baltimore and Brooklyn were basically the same person. The owner of Cleveland and St. Louis were the same person. The owner of Pittsburgh and Louisville were the same person. And there was also a relationship between the owners of New York and Cincinnati. So what happened is Baltimore and Brooklyn basically combined teams. The best players from Baltimore went to Brooklyn, and Ned Hanlon, the manager, went to Brooklyn. Same thing with Cleveland and St. Louis. The best players from Cleveland went to St. Louis. And they didn't do it in this year, but the next year, the best players from Louisville went to Pittsburgh. So there were these syndicate teams, and as I write in the book, nobody else in the league could come up with a team to beat Selee, but if they put teams together, maybe they can. And they did. The Brooklyn team won in 1899 and 1900. Ned Hanlon was the manager of those teams. So again, going from 1891 to 1900, the manager of the National League Championship was either Selee or Hanlon. And
that's crazy.
Yeah, and so that's what happened. And I mean, the players that we're talking about transferring are not Humpty Dumptys. You know, it's like Wee Willie Keeler is one of the ones that was going from Baltimore to Brooklyn. Cy Young was one of the ones going from Cleveland to St. Louis, and Hannes Wagner is one of the ones going from Louisville to Pittsburgh. So you know, there's top players that are involved in this, and Selee kept trying to keep up with this, and they were close in 1899. Then in 1900 it got a little worse, and then his last year in Boston was 1901. Well, you know what happened in 1901. The American League started. Owners of the National League had to make a decision to whether or not they were going to fight, you know. And as I mentioned, Arthur Sodden, the owner of the leader of the 3 owners of the Boston Beaneaters team, who had been involved very seriously in baseball wars before then and had been a militant. You know, he was very much against the American Association. He was very much against the Players League, and he fought. He would spend money, and he fought. When it came time to the American League War, he basically became a pacifist. He just said, I'm not fighting anymore. You know, if people get more money, fine, they get more money. Well, virtually all the hitters on the 1900 Boston Beaneaters, Jimmy Collins, Tenney stayed, but Collins left, and all of the outfield, Hugh Duffy left, the other outfielders, was Chick Stahl, went to the Boston Red Sox. Most of them went to the Red Sox. Now, they were able to keep their pitching staff, and their pitching staff was fantastic. Their pitching staff was really great. But they ended up with a .500 record because they'd lost all their hitters. And they basically then Selee kind of decided they told him that they didn't want him back anymore, so they hired another manager. But he was still in demand, so he didn't have any trouble getting another job.
Yeah, before we get into that, and I promise you we will, there's one more question I have about his time with the Beaneaters, and it's something that you alluded to earlier. Under Selee, the Beaneaters were regarded as a gentlemanly team, a stark contrast from the other teams like Pittsburgh and any other team you want to mention. Why did he have his teams avoid that prevalent rough-and-tumble style?
I really never got an answer to that in doing it. It basically it just said that he was a gentleman. He personally was a gentleman. He was not a roughneck, which a lot of players were back then. He hadn't played, so he hadn't really. When I say he hadn't played professionally. He did play when he was a kid, but he never really played in the style of that they were talking about. And as far as I can tell, he just never taught his teams how to do that. That's the best answer I can give you. He was, like I said, he was a gentleman. His father was a minister, his mother was a doctor, a homeopathic doctor, but she was a doctor, and so he was raised that way, and I just think he was a gentleman, and he taught his teams to play like gentlemen.
So let me ask you this: if he had played before he got to the Beaneaters in 1890, do you think he would have had his teams adopt that rough-and-tumble style?
Yes, I think that. That's all I can say. I don't have any idea to know that, but I do think that.
Okay. All right. I mean, look, it's just a fun hypothetical to think about. Talking to Richard Bressler, the author of Frank Selee, Hall of Fame manager of the Boston Beaneaters and Chicago Cubs. So now it's time to get to the Cubs. In 1902, Selee took over as Cubs manager, or as they were then called, the Orphans.
Yeah, they were called about 4 different things.
Well, yes. How did Chicago come to hire him?
Well, it goes back to that name that I mentioned before, James Hart. James Hart was, as I said, James Hart, who had been a foe. He'd been a manager against Selee in the minors from 1887 to 1888, and then he had managed the Boston team in preceding Selee in 1889. He then went to work for Albert Spalding, who owned the Chicago White Stockings, as they were called back then. He went to work for him in his sporting goods company. He did that for like a year and a half, and then Spalding brought him to the Chicago White Stockings to be the business manager of the team, which is what his background had been. He had been a business manager of a team well before he started in as a manager. And Spalding was in the process of getting out of owning the Chicago team. Spalding is by the way is a great story. He's Michael Jordan Michael Jordan from the 1870s to the 1890s. I mean, he was a great player. He founded a sporting goods company and became a millionaire. He owned his team, and he gave up his team to run his sporting goods company. And can
I just say he should be in the Hall of Fame as a player as well as
an
executive.
I agree, but then he was basically getting out, and he supposedly offered Cap Anson, his best player and captain and manager, a chance to buy the team. Anson claimed that he set too high of a price and he couldn't afford it, and he gave Anson a bit of time to buy the team, and he couldn't raise the money. Then he went to Hart and said, "Okay, you can buy the team," and Hart did buy the team. Hart was able to buy the team. So Hart bought the team in the early 1890s. And there's another thing that I had learned in doing research for this book and for my prior book. is that Cap Anson in after the 1887 season, it's not only now that this was done. Cap Anson signed a 10-year contract in 1887 to be a player manager, and he filled it out. By the time he retired, he was 45. But he played the whole time. So Anson was in charge, and through 1887, the team, which had been the best team in the majors in the decades of the 1880s, was slowly getting worse. Then they had hired a couple of more managers, and after the 1901 season, when the Cubs, I went by the name of the Colts because that's what most of the newspaper that I used as my research called them, the Colts, almost exclusively. But they also called them the Orphans, and they called them the Zephyrs, and they called them the Seeleys, and they would make up a nickname any day.
Yeah, Baseball Reference has them as the Orphans. That's why I said that.
Right. So, and the Orphans comes from when Cap Anson left. That's when they called them the Orphans, because Cap Anson had been there for 24 years, so he left, and then they called them the Orphans. So Hart knew Selee. He knew that Selee had just gotten fired or had been let go. He wasn't fired because he didn't have a contract beyond that. He was just let go. And Hart knew him, and he wanted him, so he hired him. And that was right after the 1901 season. So Selee finished out the 1901 season with Boston, and then started up in beginning of 1902 with the Chicago team.
Now, when you think of 1900s Cubs baseball, there are three names that pop into your head: Joe Tinker, Johnny Evers, and Frank Chance.
Right.
Can you lay out how Selee cultivated that legendary double play combination?
Sure. The first thing is that when he got there, he had seen Frank Chance play since 1898. Frank Chance had been in with the Chicago team since 1898. Frank Chance during that time was mostly a catcher. He played other positions, but he thought his position was catcher. In 1902, in spring training, which he had looked at what he had obviously seen the Chicago team the year before because he had managed against them, and he knew one of the things they needed he needed some infielders. So he brought like 20 new infielders to a training camp. Now the training camp, just to go from a personal note, the training camp went from Chicago. They didn't go way south. They went to where I live now, Champaign, Illinois, the home of the University of Illinois. That's where their training camp was. That's where spring training was. Yes, that's where spring training was. And one of the 20 infielders he brought was Joe Tinker. And Joe Tinker, as far as Selee was concerned, beat out the other players. He saw these other players, and he saw Tinker, and Tinker at that point thought he was a third baseman. He had been playing third base in the minor leagues. Selee said to him, "No, you're a shortstop." And Tinker didn't really buy that, and he went on and played shortstop in 1902 and made something like 72 errors. But Selee said, "You're going to do it, and you're going to be fine." And he turned out to be right. And then Selee had brought along his second baseman from Boston. His second baseman in Boston had been Bobby Lowe. Bobby Lowe, who was in the Hall of Fame and was a really good player throughout the whole 1890s. Bobby Lowe was the player who played for Selee more than anybody else. And he brought him along when Boston had released him and Selee signed him for Chicago. Well, so Lowe played second base in the 1902 season, and he started playing it in most of the 1903 season. He had some injuries during both times because he was getting up there. He was like in his mid-30s. And he had some injuries, so he didn't play as much as he had in Boston, but he was still playing fairly well. And then I think it was like late July of 1903, Lowe broke his ankle. He had a serious injury, so he was out for the year. And basically, Selee knew him and knew that he really didn't want to have to try to come back and all of that. And he knew that it was time to replace him anyway. So Selee got him a job as the manager of the Denver minor league team. And he called, and I've never been able to discover who this particular scout was, but he called a friend of his who was a scout in the East and said, "I need a second baseman." and they sent him Johnny Evers.
That's a hell of a find.
Right. And they sent him Johnny Evers, and there's a really good story that I was not aware that I found in the Hall of Fame in Johnny Evers' file, where they sent Evers was living in Troy, New York, which is where he's from, and he was playing ball up there. And they sent him. The scout went to him, and Selee said, "Okay, I'll take him." He didn't know anything about him. It's not like nowadays where you could see the guy on TV or something. It was
right.
1903, and so the scout in Troy went to Evers and said, "Okay, the Chicago Major League team, which I think he would have said Chicago Colts back then, wants to sign you. They're going to sign you, and their next game is in Philadelphia, and it's tomorrow, and here's a train ticket. Go there." Well, he got on a train from Troy, New York, went to Philadelphia, didn't sleep the whole way, didn't eat, got there, played the game. They played him at shortstop that day. I can't remember why, but they played him at shortstop that day, and he had 8 chances and made 4 errors, and didn't get any hits. And so they went. So they after the game, the Cubs lost the game, and the Chicago team lost the game, and they went to the hotel afterwards. And Evers was eating off by himself, and Selee came down and sat down to him, and Evers said, "Okay, here's your meal money for the rest of the trip, and we'll see you tomorrow." And Evers says, "Geez, you're not going to just get rid of me after I made such a botch of things today?" And Selee said to him, "No, son, we know you got on the train. We know you didn't sleep. You know you didn't eat. I bet if you get a good night's sleep and you come back tomorrow and play well, you'll do a good job."
Wow.
So that's how Evers told the story. Evers. That's another thing. I learned this I learned this in my last book. Everybody called him Evers outside of Troy, New York. In Troy, New York, he was known as Evers. That's how they pronounced it up there.
Huh.
I don't know why.
All this time, I was afraid of mispronouncing Selee.
Yeah. So those were the 3 guys. Those were the three best known. Now also during the 1902 season, the best pitcher on the Cubs at that point, a man named Jack Taylor, he liked to have chances as catcher. He just they'd both been on the team for a few years. He liked having chances as catcher. Now in 1902, the Cubs had I'll use the word Cubs, even though it isn't how I say it in the book. The Cubs they had 2 catchers basically. Chance was one, another guy's named John Kling. They were both there in 1901. After looking at them for about 2 weeks, Selee knew immediately that Kling was a better catcher. He was defensively a much better catcher. Chance he tried hard, but he was very prone to injury, and being a catcher back then was making you even worse prone to injury because they didn't have shin pads, they didn't have a lot of their masks weren't padded.
And come around.
Right, so it was not. So he started a project of his own to get Chance to move. To get him to move into other players. He would move him to the outfield, and he tried him at other positions. Now, about Chance's last game that he caught in 1902 was something like in June, and he did play a fair number of games the rest of the year, and he didn't really establish himself at first base until about August. But once he got to first base, he was basically the best first baseman in the National League for the next 4 years. He was a really good hitter. He was fast. He would usually steal like 50 bases a year. He eventually ended up being the captain of the team. Which this is another thing that we should talk about a little more, is that one of the things that I learned in doing this book and in doing the book I did before this, which was called the 1910 Cubs and A's, about the 1910 pennant race, is that
$1 infield.
Yes, 100,000 back then. That's
100,000. Excuse me.
And actually, they didn't start till the next year, but 3 of them were there. Then the next guy came up in 1911. But anyway, that's picking nits. The manager, and Selee was manager. That was his title through all this time. What he didn't do was run the game. He would usually pick the starting pitcher and he would pick the lineup, but then he would basically put it in the hands of the captain, whoever the captain was. I was kind of shocked, and throughout all of the newspaper research I did in this, they usually, if pitchers were changed, which was uncommon back then because it was, probably 80 to 90% of the games were complete games back then. But if
we
pitchers,
need more of that.
Right, I agree. But if pitchers were changed, they would always say that the captain did it, not the manager. Selee, and I write this in the book, and the picture on the front shows it. He never wore a uniform. He was Connie Mack before Connie Mack. He was in the dugout with a suit and tie. Sometimes in the dugout, sometimes he would sit in the stands. But, he really didn't run the game. The game was run by the captain. And it was that way through 1910 with Connie Mack. Connie Mack had a captain who ran the game. And they were playing against the Cubs in the World Series, where Frank Chance was the playing manager. So he was in the game and ran and was the manager. So, but the captain ran the game. So when Bobby Lowe first came to Chicago, Selee named him captain. And then after Lowe got hurt, and he knew he wasn't coming back, Selee, in a very unusual thing for back then, let the players pick the captain. He didn't name a captain. He made a recommendation. He said he thought his third baseman, who was named Doc Casey, should be the captain. But he said, it's up to you guys. You select it. And they had a vote, and Johnny Evers actually said this in his book that was published in 1910. He listed how the vote came out. The vote came out Chance 11, Casey 3, Kling 2. So there were 16 guys on the team. And Chance was elected captain. That's how Chance became captain, because Selee let them elect him.
Interesting. Very, very interesting. So there's one more great Chicago Cub to talk about. Would you be able to describe the Mordecai Three-Finger Brown trade?
Yeah, that was another thing that was it turned out very fortunate for the Cubs. Like I said, Jack Taylor was the best pitcher for the Cubs in 1902, and he was a guy who I learned about in doing the research about the Cubs. He had an amazing stretch of something like, and I don't remember it, it's in my other book, of something like 400 straight starts where he completed the game. This is over about an 8-year period. So, and I might be off on the number. I might be 300. It was like
it's still impressive.
It was like for 8 years he finished, and he relieved occasionally other people. He didn't do that often, but he did relieve other people. But anyway, he was the Cubs' best pitcher in 1902. In 1902. No, right. Excuse me, in 1902 and in 1903. Now, in 1903 was the first year after peace had been made with the American League. So there was a World Series between the champions of the leagues, between Pittsburgh and Boston, which wasn't an official World Series. It was just those two teams worked it out themselves. And as it turned out, after the year in several of the other teams in the major leagues, the two Chicago teams, the two teams in Ohio, the two teams in St. Louis, played postseason series against each other. And those were actually just as popular in their locale as the World Series was. Because, this was new, the World Series. Nobody really knew how to deal with it. So in Chicago, they had a 15-game series between the Cubs and the White Sox. And they announced it, early on in the year that, we're going to play an exhibition series against each other. And they did. And Jack Taylor, who was, like I said, was the best pitcher on the Cubs that year. He had won something like 25 games, which a good year for somebody back then was like 25 and 15 or something like that. So, so he had a year like that. And he pitched in the playoff series. He actually pitched the first game and threw a shutout. And then he pitched 3 more times and got shelled. Each time he pitched, he got shelled by the White Sox. And they ended up playing 15 games. One of them ended up in a tie, course, ties were very common back then because of darkness, and particularly you get to October and there's no daylight savings time. You're going to get dark pretty quick.
Yeah.
So they didn't play a game on top of it. And Taylor was quoted as saying by people that he was quoted as saying, I don't know if it was the official quote in the newspaper, it was just an underground quote going around. He's saying, Hart's paid me $100 to win. I got paid $500 to lose. What would you do? So that in the exhibition series, not during a regular year, but in the exhibition series. So that was out there. Then the Hart came back, and I think Hart put it in the public press, and Taylor said, wait a minute, you're not, and I'm never playing for you again. So he just said that. I mean, obviously he didn't have, a lot of people said that back then. They didn't have any power to do anything about it, but he said it.
Right.
And Selee said, okay, I don't think we want to have this guy anyway. He'll just be a bit of a disruption. And he had seen, Brown had been a rookie with the Cardinals, the St. Louis team, in 1903. He had pitched. The Cardinals were an awful team. The Cardinals were just terrible in the aughts and the teens. They got good in the 20s and have stayed good ever since. But they were terrible then. And he was on that team, and he was like 9-20, which again it was not a bad record for on that team. It was about even with what their winning percentage was. So. So Selee asked Chance, and he asked other players, who's somebody that we could, who's a good pitcher out there that we could trade Taylor for, and they mentioned Brown. They recommended Brown, and Selee had seen Brown, and he knew that he thought he was pretty good, so they traded for him. They traded Jack Taylor and a catcher for Mordecai Brown and a catcher from St. Louis, and that's when Brown came in, and so that's when that came in. And I want to go on. I know you've asked me about that, and I just want to go on. The reason I got interested in Selee was because of my other book, when I did that 1910 book, because I got into the history of both the Cubs and the A's, and I went through it all the way forward. And I had never really heard of Selee before that. And
I don't think anyone has. I think he's one of the guys. He's one of the guys that when you go to the Baseball Hall of Fame, you say, he's in the Hall of Fame? Cool.
Yeah.
Okay, who's next?
Yeah, who's next? and so I learned, and then I also, there's a really neat thing that I had in the Bill James Historical Abstract, which I had never thought of, which is that the best 10-year stretch in baseball of any team is the Chicago, modern, going after 1901, is the Chicago Cubs 1904 to 1913, based on winning percentage, based on regular season winning percentage. They have the record for the most wins in every number of years between 1 and 10. Consecutive, every number of consecutive years. They still have the record for most wins in one season, 116. That happened in 1906. The Mariners tied it, but they tied it in a season of
162 games.
Well, of 162 games, and the Cubs that year only played 152 because they had a 20-game lead. There were a couple of rainouts they didn't make up. Their record was 116 and 130 and 36. They only played 152 games and they won 116.
Yankees came close with 114 for whatever it's worth.
Yes, they did. But 1 year, 2 year, 3 year, 4. If you go through, they're all from 1904 to 1906. Well, Selee was the manager in 1904 and half of 1905, most of 1905. But he basically built that team. Tinker, Evers, and Chance we talked about. Johnny Kling was there. And then Mordecai Brown, he got him. Now, then there was another thing which I learned when I was researching that book, which several other players who came into that, the Cub team that is remembered then as 1906 to 1910. They won four pennants in 5 years. The year that they didn't win the pennant, they won 104 games. But, so they won 4 pennants in 5 years. They were in the World Series 4 times. They were the first team ever to win the World Series back-to-back in 1907 and 1908. And he built that team. And he built it with those guys that I talked about, and then there were about 3 or 4 other guys. Wildfire Schulte, who was an outfielder, Ed Ruhlbach, who was a pitcher, Artie Hoffman, who was a utility man. Those guys were all on the team when Selee was managing them before he left in 1905. And they were all found by a scout. And the scout that found them was a man named George Huff. George Huff was the athletic director and baseball coach at the University of Illinois. That was his job. And when I did the book, the first book, again, I was researching the year 1910 at that time. So I could never find, I went to the University of Illinois library and looked up George Huff's papers, and there was nothing in there about it. And I didn't have any idea how they made the connection, how these two guys got the connection, and Huff and Selee got all these great players out of it. Well, it turned out when I did the research for this book, the Cubs came to Champaign for spring training in 1982, and they did all their exhibition games against the University of Illinois. So
that's a good way of doing it.
That's how they got to know each other. So
that's a good way of doing it.
Right. So and all of these great players came from that connection. And Evers actually talks about it in his book. He says, that's where we got these guys, is because George Huff was a great scout, and Selee had this relationship with him. So that's where that came from.
Talking to Richard Bressler, the author of Frank Selee, Hall of Fame manager of the Boston Beaneaters and Chicago Cubs. And Richard, I'll get you out on this, the question that I've been looking forward to asking you the most. How did Selee grow his awesome mustache?
That's a good question. Unfortunately, I don't know the answer to it, but I do know that I've seen a lot of pictures of ball players in the 1890s, and a lot of them had mustaches like that. So maybe he was just trying to look like one of the guys. Although he did have it, I saw a couple of pictures of him when he was in the minor leagues, and he did have it back then. But he does have a fairly impressive mustache, and
yes, he does.
And
I'd kill for a mustache like that.
And I mean, I made a comment in the book. One of the last pictures I saw of him when he was after he was out of the Cubs. He went back to the minor leagues, and for a reason that I'll have to go into. And he was doing it in Pueblo, Colorado. And there was a picture in the Pueblo paper that I saw in 1906, and it's just a picture of him standing. And he really looks like a prosperous undertaker. I mean, that's what he looked like. Because he's always properly dressed. He was always dressed in a coat and tie. Any picture that I saw, I should say, I'm sure he took them off from time to time in his life, but I never saw him. I never saw a picture of him without a coat and tie.
Hey, I mean, look, if you're going to act first class, you got to dress first class.
That's right.
I'm sure you'd agree with that.
Yes, that's right.
All right, Richard. Thank you very much for your time.
Thank you for having me on, and I appreciate it.
All right. That was Richard Bressler. His book is Frank Selee, Hall of Fame manager of the Boston Beaneaters and Chicago Cubs. Thanks for listening. Here comes the outro.
Thanks for the plug, Jacob from the past. It does mean a lot. Until tomorrow, I am Jacob Valk saying that their 4-4 road trip could just as easily have gone the other way.